November 1955, at a rally in support of the Oslo Peace Accords, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a 28-year-old religious Zionist named Yigal Amir. This assassination is a trauma that still echoes in Israeli society today. Historians and journalists have called the Rabin assassination one of history's most effective political murders. The murder of Rabin immediately derailed Israel's peace process with the PLO. And after Rabin, Benjamin Netanyahu became the new prime minister, and he brought in a right-wing government, and he ushered in a new right-wing era of Israeli governance. And it's that era of Israeli governance that we're living through today. Of course, Benjamin Netanyahu is again the prime minister of Israel, leading the most right-wing coalition in the history of Israel's democracy, and he is the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history. The Rabin assassination was a trauma in Israeli society, and it was a major turning point in the life of Ami Ayalon. And in his memoir, Friendly Fire, Ayalon describes the incitement that led up to the Rabin murder. And if you listen carefully, you can hear him place blame where it certainly belongs. Quote, "A photo montage at an anti-Oslo rally featured Arafat's keffiyeh wrapped around Rabin's forehead. A different placard had Rabin wearing a Nazi uniform and a swastika armband. With blood and fire we will expel Rabin, young toughs chanted, their fists lifted in defiance. At one rally, the young politician, Benjamin Netanyahu, joined by Ariel Sharon, looked on without comment as crowds carried a coffin on their shoulders and chanted for 2 hours, death to Rabin." End quote. Today, Yigal Amir is sitting in prison, serving his life sentence, and just like the mainstream conspiracy theories that surround the JFK assassination in America, a majority of right-wing Israelis don't believe that Yigal Amir actually assassinated Rabin. And this is a staggering thing. This is like an amazing, amazing, amazing thing, because there's video footage of Yigal Amir shooting Rabin, and Yigal Amir is completely unrepentant and proud that he has killed Rabin. But the conspiracy theorists believe that Yigal Amir actually fired blanks at Rabin, and that Rabin was murdered separately in the car ride to the hospital. And of course, along the same lines, a lot of right-wing Israelis are agitating for Amir's release from prison today. About a year before his assassination, the Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin asked Ami Ayalon to lead the Shin Bet, and Ayalon turned down the post, having no appetite for the job. But immediately following Rabin's assassination, the previous director of the Shin Bet resigned out of a sense of responsibility for the slack security that enabled Amir to kill Rabin. And then the interim Prime Minister Shimon Peres again asked Ami Ayalon to head the Shin Bet. And at this point, Ami Ayalon agrees. Ayalon would serve as the head of the Shin Bet from the years 1996 to 2000 under the prime ministerships of Benjamin Netanyahu and then Ehud Barak. And so this is an incredible moment in the memoir, Friendly Fire. This is an incredible moment in Ami Ayalon's life. Ami was intending to retire. He wanted to go work in the private sector, doing nothing related to the military. But he's thrust back into public service, and he's thrust into this new role, this role of security, the head of this quiet, secretive security organization with a tremendous amount of power, the power to arrest anyone in Israeli society and torture people. And he has to figure out how to run this organization and how to deal with the current onslaught of terror that Israel is reeling from, both domestic, from the right-wing camp, and also from the Palestinians. And what happens in the book, and the character arc, the narrative of this memoir, what makes it so amazing and so unique, is that this experience, this job, transforms Ami Ayalon. He comes into this with no background in this kind of security operation, with no deep understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with a kind of regular, standard Israeli understanding of what's going on, a sense of Israel's justice. He says that, if his life had taken a different turn, he might have been a settler and spent his time settling new lands in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank. But that's not the path his life took. And he finds himself confronted with a reality that he was not prepared for. And it changes him dramatically. It changes him drastically. I'm fascinated by the story. I'm fascinated by what I think of as like this curse of knowledge, this burden. And the book is like just a demonstration of the stress and anxiety of living with this perspective. And I would encourage, I know most of my viewers are probably very progressively minded modern people who will not be surprised by anything Ami Ayalon has to say in this memoir. But for people to whom Ayalon's criticisms feel difficult to hear, feel upsetting, feel wrong, I just ask you to focus on the character arc here, the story being told of someone who gets a perspective, and even if you think it's a wrong perspective or comes to a wrong conclusion, the sense in which they are burdened and broken almost. They are burdened and driven almost to the brink of madness, you might say, from this new understanding, this new perspective. So feeling optimistic, feeling determined, Ayalon gets to work, figuring out what is the cause of terror in Israel? Where do these terrorists come from? And he does the legwork. He spends time in the West Bank, in the territories. He meets with Palestinians, all sorts of different Palestinians. He learns the stories. He speaks to experts, and he tries to make sense. He does the work that so many Israelis, so many Zionists and pro-Israel Jewish Americans fail to do, which is understand the other side of the curtain, see through the ideological blinders, try to understand what's happening from another person's perspective. So, from the book, quote, "We needed to find a way to understand the motivations of our Islamist enemies. Why would a perfectly healthy student strap on a suicide belt and kill people on their way to school or while sitting in a cafe? As a soldier, I killed perfect strangers all the time, but they were combatants. I never knowingly attacked civilians, people I considered to be innocent bystanders. Searching for answers, I read through a file put together by Mati Steinberg, an expert on Arab affairs." We're skipping a bit here. "In our first meeting, I peppered Mati with questions on the history of Palestinian nationalism. He told me straight out that I would never understand the Palestinians if I didn't read their national poets and familiarize myself with their songwriters, graffiti artists, and clandestine newspapers. Mati also added to my reading list Amira Haas, the Haaretz journalist who reported on Palestinian affairs from Ramallah and Gaza. She'll give you a picture of the Palestinian street more revealing than anything here," he said, with arms spread wide as if to take in the entire Shin Bet. End quote. And so this is the new information. This is the new perspective that Ayalon is confronted with. And he makes a discovery. He realizes that what's happening is not some mystery. It's not because the Palestinians are completely incomprehensible, or they're barbaric, or they're animals, or they're stuck in the dark ages. It makes sense. What's happening in Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is the totally comprehensible, understandable outcome of Israeli policy. It's the totally comprehensible human response to certain conditions in which the Palestinians are living. And this is a shocking, startling revelation for Ayalon, and it changes the way he perceives everything in Israeli society. It changes the trajectory of his entire life. It changes his entire sense of purpose in the world. And of course, it makes him run into these very stiff, strong headwinds of Israeli society. He's no longer in the majority opinion. He no longer holds all the orthodoxies that his society largely holds, and he finds himself very much an outsider now. This is one example of the kind of internal monologue that Ayalon is dealing with. After spending a bunch of time in the West Bank and meeting with different people in the West Bank, he's driving back now. He spent time imbibing the stories and imbibing the experience for the first time, seeing for the first time what it's like to be a Palestinian, to live in the West Bank as a Palestinian. Quote, "On the drive back to Jerusalem, I thought about something Netanyahu had recently told Newsweek. We will surround Israel with walls to defend against wild beasts." Wild beasts? How would I have responded to a brutal foreign army capturing and occupying my country for 50 years? Right? This is the revelation. This is the empathy that so many right-wing Zionist Jews don't want to do. Understandably, you might say. But he's forced to do. He continues, "I thought of Jibril and his 13 siblings, raised by traditional parents in a stone house in the dusty village of Dura." Skipping a bit. "At the age of 14, I was swimming in the Sea of Galilee with Srulik, dreaming of playing hero in battles near and far. Jibril, born in 1953, was 14 when we conquered the West Bank. A year later, the Shabak arrested him for helping smuggle Egyptian military officers caught behind enemy lines in 1967 out of Palestine. He had his first encounter with Israelis when an IDF major came to arrest him and slapped his father across the face in front of the entire family. In the 4 months Jibril spent in a Hebron prison, he endured countless rounds of slaps, beatings, and other forms of humiliation, and resolved to fight his captors. End quote. That, of course, is just scratching the surface of the work that Ami Ayalon does, and he shares the poetry that affected him, and just, again, this awareness of the sense of Palestinian nationalism, this awareness of the sense of Palestinian identity, and this desire for self-determination. And his whole worldview is shaken by this realization. The tectonic shift that happened in Israeli society after the Rabin assassination was a change in consensus around whether or not it was fruitful, productive, possible to be in dialogue with the Palestinians. Rabin was a partner with Yasser Arafat in the Oslo Accords. They believed in doing exchanges of land for peace. After the Rabin assassination, the consensus in Israel was no partner. There's no one to talk to. Ayalon, meanwhile, is developing all sorts of professional relationships with Palestinians. And he comes to the conclusion, based on his work and his experience and his relationships, that there absolutely can be a partner with the Palestinians. And he becomes a fighter, a crusader, butting heads with prime ministers and politicians saying, you have to talk, you have to make a partner. The Israeli consensus at the time is that we can't have any peace talks until we have security. And Ami Ayalon says that's exactly backwards. You cannot have security without talks. You can't have security without concessions. As long as there's no dialogue, as long as there's no sense that there's a political process the Palestinians can work towards, you will have increased despair and increased violence and increased terrorism. And he felt that his duty as someone who's responsible for protecting and defending Israeli citizens was to ring the alarm and alert people to the necessity of dialogue, that you cannot have security without dialogue. Quote, the no partner line proved the single most catastrophic PR stunt in Israeli political history. I spoke freely to him. Him is, in this case, is Ehud Barak, the prime minister at the time. I said, quote, it's up to us to decide which story we tell ourselves. Arafat, in my experience, doesn't have a single face. He's got 1,000. You can pick out the no partner face just as easily as you can pick out a partner face. And the particular face you've been selling to the public says more about you than it does Arafat. Let me tell you something. As someone who has accompanied you from the day you became prime minister, which of Arafat's faces you choose to present to the world now is the most important issue you have, and you owe it to the citizens of Israel to make the right choice. End quote. Ayalon tells us about his contacts in Gaza, his relationships, the way in which, through cooperation, they're able to protect Israeli citizens, to arrest terrorists. These are people who are within Hamas and making arrests and feeding information about Hamas terrorist activity. And these informants that Ayalon is working with, they say to him, quote, Ami, he must have said 12 times, we are not your collaborators. We don't put Hamas members in prison for you. We're only doing it because our public believes that at the end of the day, we'll have a state alongside the state of Israel. The minute we stop believing that, you can forget about cooperation. Ayalon continues, these people, they were risking a civil war with Hamas to hold up their end of the bargain. And Barak wouldn't even give them the pittance Bibi had promised. End quote. That is the frustration that Ayalon is wrestling with. That is what's tormenting him over his tenure as the head of the Shin Bet. That he needs a peace process. He needs dialogue. And the Israeli government is refusing to give anything. And the consequence is that it leads to Palestinian despair. It leads to millions of Palestinians with nothing to lose. Ayalon's writing is so fiery and it's so passionate, and you could just sense the sincerity and the desperation almost in what he writes. Quote, to kill terrorist leaders without addressing the despair of their supporters is a fool's errand and produces more frustration, more despair, and more terrorism. The more we, quote, win such a misbegotten war, the more we debase civil society and democratic norms. The more we turn our society into an Orwellian dystopia in which truth and lies are indistinguishable. End quote. If I wanted to take up an hour of your time, I could cite passage after passage, articulate, beautiful, eloquent passage after passage where Ayalon breaks down and describes the cycle of violence, this tit for tat violence, the sense in which every single Israeli operation, every time the Shin Bet kills a high-level terrorist, it creates a debt because the Palestinians retaliate. And he sees no end to this cycle. It's like a death spiral of endless cycle of violence. And he finds himself begging people to stop it, to stop assassinating terrorists. Ami Ayalon's successor at the Shin Bet is Avi Dichter. In the next video I post, I'm going to post a clip from the documentary The Gatekeepers, and there will be in there some quotes from Avi Dichter. So I want you to remember him. I think he speaks very powerfully in The Gatekeepers. But this is Ami Ayalon saying he and a few other former heads of the Shin Bet, they visited him because of a targeted assassination that he did. Quote, "We pummeled Avi with criticism Israeli style, with no regard for protocols or niceties. Too much was at stake for us to refrain from pointing out the problems with his strategy and proposing what could be done to prevent the next bloodbath. I reminded him that in the 12 months leading up to the Second Intifada, only one Israeli died at the hands of terrorists. Why? Because at the time, most Palestinians were opposed to terrorism, and Jibril and Arafat's security forces could therefore fight Hamas without being perceived as collaborators and traitors. This despite the fact that the number of settlers in the West Bank had more than doubled since Oslo. And now," I continued, "we're getting more terror because our way of fighting. It has robbed the Palestinians of any hope that we are willing to give them their freedom." "I don't do politics," Dichter said. "We had an opportunity to hit a terrorist, so we took it." "But Avi, your job isn't to kill terrorists, it's to prevent terror, which isn't the same thing." Shortly after this, the Minister of Defense chimes in and he says to Ayalon, "Why don't you just enjoy your retirement?" Effectively kicking him out and saying, "We don't want to hear you anymore." The book portrays the sense from a picture which only an insider like Ami Ayalon can paint of a security apparatus run amok, run out of control. A security apparatus which is insatiable, which is always looking for more and more targets, for more and more violence. At one point, this security apparatus goes after one of Ayalon's dear friends, one of his core collaborators, an academic who works in the West Bank, who Ayalon sees as a tremendous ally for peace and for security. The man's name is Sari, and the Shin Bet, after Ayalon's tenure, ransacks his offices and steals his files. So Ayalon says to the public security minister of Ariel Sharon, quote, "He openly calls for an end to the killing of Israeli civilians, and he's been attacked for it by his own people. Just tell me, why the hell did you go after him? If anyone represents hope for the Palestinians, it's him." Why? Landau seemed genuinely surprised by my question, as if the answer to the puzzle was obvious. Because this professor is our most dangerous enemy. Elsewhere, Minister Landau dubbed Sari the pretty face of terrorism. With such talk from Landau, a systems analyst by profession, who had a PhD from MIT, I had proof that Israel was not just slipping into tyranny, we were also rapidly going insane. End quote. And this excerpt, man, like so many, is so heartbreaking. Yeah, I'll just say that as someone growing up in this world, the pro-Israel Jewish Zionist world of America, passages like that so resonate. And I'll leave it at that. I don't want to go into any more details. Another core part of the book, which we just don't have time to go into because there's so much I would love to read, but we just can't make time for everything, is the way in which Ayalon explores how instead of collaborating, cooperating, talking, trying to find common ground, the Israeli policy has always been to undermine, to delegitimize the sources, the focal points of Palestinian authority. And in doing that, it's to sow chaos. And in delegitimizing and abandoning and neglecting sources of moderate Palestinian power, it creates vacuums and creates opportunities for extremists to rise up and fill that void. And he just describes this in excruciating, painful detail. Of course, Ayalon believes the Israeli government needs to make concessions to the Palestinians, but there's right ways and wrong ways to make concessions. There's right ways and wrong ways to withdraw from territory. And so in 2005, Ariel Sharon made a hasty, complete unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. And Ayalon talks a lot about that in the book. So, quoting his friend Sari now. Sari cited approvingly from Kimmerling's book, Fighting the Demons, Israel's Killer General and His Legacy. The aim is to make life so unbearable that the greatest possible majority of the rival population, especially its elite and middle classes, will leave the area voluntarily. Typically, all such actions are taken in the name of law and order. A key aim is to achieve the power to define one's own side as the law enforcers and the other as criminals and terrorists. Sari knew Palestinian history a lot better than I did, and he rattled off a long list of Sharon's attempts to kill Arafat and destroy the PLO. Sharon's current plot, Sari said, was to produce Somalia-like chaos in the West Bank and Gaza, thus delegitimizing Palestinian nationalism and justifying our continued occupation. A different part of the book, talking about the siege on Gaza during the prime ministership of Ehud Olmert. In parallel with his earnest pursuit of a peace deal, Olmert made a mess of Gaza. Following Hamas's takeover, Israel teamed up with Egypt to impose a hermetic blockade on Gaza, entrapping 1.5 million people with barbed wire and our Navy's ships. The idea was, if we ratcheted up the level of despair, Gaza's population would rebel against Hamas. Just as in our misguided assault on Hezbollah in Lebanon, we embarked upon a strategy with no evidence to support it. Inside the cabinet, my protests fell on deaf ears. My fellow ministers lacked the will to examine the situation or engage in an honest discussion. We were like drunken sailors on a ship headed for the shoals. End quote. Of course, entrapping Gaza in a blockade and ratcheting up the level of despair is not going to cause Gaza's population to rebel against Hamas. Quite the opposite. This video has gone on long enough. I just want to end with some quotes that feel particularly relevant today during the ongoing hot war. I put war in quotation marks because Ami doesn't really think of these things as wars in the conventional sense. And that's part of what he describes in his book. But we'll say the quote war between Israel and Hamas right now. So regarding the military operation in 2002 during the Second Intifada called Operation Defensive Shield, which was carried out, Ayalon voiced criticisms of that operation. And I think these are criticisms we should be thinking about today. Quote, Operation Defensive Shield produced scorched earth and left only an empty pit into which what was left of the Palestinian Authority simply disappeared. Nobody asked the simple question, after we killed the terrorists, who would be left to talk about building a better future? End quote. Elsewhere in the book, again, I think this is so scary and prophetic. Quote, if we continue to dish out humiliation and despair, the popularity of Hamas will grow. And if we manage to push Hamas from power, we'll get Al-Qaeda. And after Al-Qaeda, ISIS. And after ISIS, God only knows. The majority of voters, as if gripped by a collective death wish, would continue to back a right-wing government hell-bent on betraying the humanistic values upon which Israel was founded. End quote. I want to read in full here an exchange Ayalon had on television in the year 2000 in Israel. And this was after a terror attack or a lynching, some mob violence. 2 Israeli soldiers took a wrong turn in the city of Ramallah, and they were lynched brutally. And there's a famous image. I remember seeing this when I was in 8th grade, and our teachers showed us this image of the Palestinian mob holding up bloody red hands, celebrating the lynching to the cheering crowd. And it's incredibly shocking and horrifying, and it shocks the conscience. And it, of course, parallels the shocking, horrifying, awful events that happened in Israel on October 7th, that terror attack, and the gruesome, horrific images and murders that were carried out there. And so the host of this television show, her name is Yachimovich. So Yachimovich, lowering her voice a few octaves, repeated what everyone in Israel was saying. that human beings are not capable of such barbarity, and therefore, by implication, the Palestinians must be some breed of wild beast. Clearly, she hoped that given my experiences, I might offer privileged insight into the murderous pathologies of our enemies. We offered peace to Arafat and his gang of hooligans, and look what we got in return. The cudgel and the whip, not peace treaties, are what such animals understand. Are Palestinians even capable of being partners in peace? She wanted to know. Of course, in reading the book, one of the ironies, the sad ironies, is that the Palestinians and Hamas, their slogans, their rhetoric is that the Zionist occupier only understands violence, only understands force. And of course, Yachimovich, the anchor in this news broadcast, this news program, is working under the assumption that Palestinians only understand force, right? So there's that symmetry there, that parallel. They both, each side thinks the other side only understands force. Anyway, so Ayalon responds, I recall sitting upright in my chair, my pulse quickening, and with a pen in my hand staring directly into the camera. It was as good a time as any to shatter cherished Israeli legends, right? End quote. And so this is, again, an example of Ayalon burdened with this knowledge, where he's now positioned like never before as an outsider to mainstream Israeli thinking, to mainstream pro-Israel Zionistic thought, because he has access to this information, to this perspective that he did not have before. So Ayalon responds, for more than 4 years, I said, with eyes locked on Yachimovich, I work closely with many Palestinians, from Arafat on down, to prevent attacks and apprehend terrorists. I explained in as measured a tone as I could muster that when Palestinians felt that preventing terrorism would lead to the end of our occupation and the establishment of their own state, they cooperated with us. What most Palestinians sought more than anything wasn't our blood. They just wanted to trust that the Israeli government would end the occupation and allow them to be free. And we've given them little reason to trust us. What I was thinking, but couldn't yet bring myself to say publicly, was that our pursuit of peace was a sham. We were still caught in the Zionism of my parents' generation that saw the entire land of Israel as our birthright. Since we refused to admit that Palestinians have rights and roots in Judea and Samaria, too, we were always looking for ways to renege on our promises. What we wanted was security, and if we could get it without handing over any more of the land of Israel, we'd do it. The news anchor Yachimovich interjects, but I cut her off. Our instinctive resort to disproportionate force, I barreled on, has created the opposite of what we want to achieve. We jeopardize our own security each time in the name of security our soldiers gun down Palestinian stone throwers, and our actions fuel calls for revenge. Yachimovich finally intervened with a question on everyone's mind. So what about these rioters? She wanted to know, returning the conversation to the lynching. Who are they? I'll tell you who they are. Flashing in my mind was something I had read in one of Dr. Shikaki's reports. The people behind the Second Intifada were disillusioned supporters of the peace process. They were not fanatics. I may not know them personally, but I met lots of people like them, once ardent backers of Oslo. I was thinking of the men I'd met who worked for Jibril, guys who risked their necks pursuing Hamas terrorists. If some of these men were now dancing in our blood, it wasn't because they were beasts. It was because they lost hope. End quote. In this video, I mostly just brushed over the parts of the book that deal most unflinchingly and seriously with the nature of the occupation, the implications of the occupation, and the way in which the occupation poisons Israeli society and Israeli politics. I want to dive into that in the next video in the series. I also want to share some really critical, powerful excerpts from the documentary The Gatekeepers, which I think is really necessary viewing here in this conversation. And yeah, just to end this video, I'll just share a quote that continues to haunt me ever since I read it. And this is Ami Ayalon talking with a friend of his, Chaim Gans, who's an author. And they're sitting in a cafe. So, quote, over a second shot of espresso, I summarize my thesis that we Israelis are at war with ourselves and not with the Palestinians. We've already created an apartheid situation in Judea and Samaria where we control Palestinians by force, denying them self-determination. Eventually, they will give up on the dream of a state. And they and most of the world will demand a single state where Jews will lose our majority and we can kiss our self-determination goodbye. From a security point of view, at that point, we'll stop fighting just wars and become world experts on unjust ones. End quote. Thank you for watching.